what is the reason why people in the post-prophetic era are not punished or have light day of judgment as the people in the prophetic era? And do we classify ourselves as lucky?
Okay. I think I did explain while I was going through this chart that the reason that people are not punished in the prophetic era is that a messenger of God delivers the truth in its ultimate form. And people who deny a messenger of God, they are pinpointed by none else than God himself. And he sends this revelation to his messengers and tells them that you have done your job, and now the people who are in front of you, they have no excuse, they have no legitimate excuse, and they're just denying out of stubbornness. So if you look at this, you'll find that in the post-prophetic era, simply because there is no messenger present, there's no messenger, so the message of God can never be delivered in its pristine form, in its ultimate form. There's bound to be some confusion, there's bound to be some misinformation, there's bound to be some lack of information. Actually, this lack of information, this misinformation or disinformation is totally ruled out in this era, because it's like God communicating through his messengers his true picture. And at the same time, people who are intentionally denying, they are also pinpointed by God himself. So you can clearly see that in the post-prophetic era, because there is no messenger, so the message of God can never be delivered in its final form. There will always be something lacking, something missing, maybe something that needs to be done more. And secondly, people who are intentionally denying God's message, because they still have the Quran with them, they can never be pinpointed, because in the prophetic era, God was pinpointing them by sending revelation or wahi to his messenger and telling them that, look here, this is a person who is not denying out of any lack of information. He's stubborn. He's just out of his own arrogance that he's doing that. So God was actually revealing that information as well. So you can see that in the post-prophetic era, neither is there any messenger who can deliver God's message in its ultimate form, nor can we pinpoint people who have deliberately denied. So this is only a facility that's going to be available here and here. So on the day of accountability also, because it was God who's going to be right there in front of us, he would tell who is the intentional denier, and obviously the message of God would have been delivered already. So that is the reason why people living in the post-prophetic era, they can never be punished. They are given this time, they are given this latitude, they are given this leverage that they can persist in their beliefs, even if they are wrong, and God is going to take them to task once and for all. So for us, the greatest reminder is that we read these stories, we read these books, and we keep on reminding ourselves that if our accountability is not taking place in this era, it's not that it's going to never take place, it's just that it has been deferred.
So since they were giving more facilities, that's why the punishment will be harsh.
That's why the punishment will be harsh.
Yeah.
So because you see, they have God's messenger himself, they have miracles that they can show, they have the reasoning that they put forth is immaculate. I cannot reason out the way a prophet of God can reason out. So you see, it is his presence that rules out any misinformation, any lack of information, any misunderstanding. But in this era, that cannot be ruled out, because as human beings, even while presenting the message of God, I make mistakes, and I'm liable to make mistakes. So that is why God will never hold these people accountable, because the facility that was there in that era is no longer here.
An extension to that question, if we believe in the post-prophetic era, will we get more rewards than those who believed in the prophetic era?
So you see, the question regarding rewards is regardless of the prophetic and post-prophetic era. So the Quran has said at one place in Surah Waqia that there would be two people, or the two categories of people on the Day of Judgment that will end up in paradise. So we just talked about paradise and hell. So the Quran says in paradise there will be two categories of righteous people. So one of them would be called the Sabiqun. Sabiqun means people who leapt to profess faith, and people who actually went to the greatest possible heights to follow Islam. And then the other category is called the Ashabul Yameen, which are the companions of the right hand. So they will also be there. They will be not as enthusiastic in their acceptance of Islam or following Islam, but they will be second best to them. So the Quran says both these categories are going to exist in the earliest of generations also, in the later generations also. The only difference is that this Sabiqun category, or the category of the top righteous people, the Quran says there'll be much more in the earlier period. So people who would be responding to the message of God in a very, very zealous way, enthusiastic way, would be more. But that is not in any way going to rule out that they cannot exist here. And you know what? Because the reason is that to reach paradise or to reach the highest grades of paradise is not dependent on the presence of a messenger or his absence. Because whatever information you have about the truth, if you act upon it in the best possible way, that's what's going to decide your ultimate fate. For example, even if you're living in the prophetic era, and out of all sincerity, out of all hard work, you reached a particular understanding of religion, and you followed that diligently, sincerely, with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, then you'll be given the same reward because you did your best. So the question is to do your best in the available circumstances.
One of the written questions we have here is, why did God not preserve the physical proof of the punishments that were given to the non-believers? Because otherwise, for someone who may doesn't believe in the Quran, will fully view that as a...
Interestingly, even that has happened. Especially if you go to the Arabian Peninsula, you'll find the remnants of the destruction of the followers of these nations. So not as far as Noah, because he lived in antiquity, which is like prehistoric times. But other nations, for example, if you might have heard of the Ad, the Samud, the people of Madian, the Shoaib. So these prophets mostly came in that region that we call the Middle East. So if you look at that place, you still go there and you'll find the remnants of destruction of these nations. And we also know the Pharaoh, the one who actually denied, and he was, he drowned. We have a very clear proof of his body being preserved. He was Tutankhamun. I think his name was Tutankhamun II. And we have his body. And regarding the Noah's Ark, we also know from the Quran that the Noah's Ark was preserved until very recently. And there are some people who still say that, like the Mount of Judi, which is like in Asia Minor near Turkey, we still have the remnants of that. So it's not that we don't have those remnants, we do have them. It's just a question of either we say that, well, these are decadent signs and things have just decayed. Either we relate it to historical happenings, or we relate it to the fact that, well, this is not just a case of simple dying away or decaying. It's actually a case of God's punishment being meted out to them.
Thank you. If God knows everything and the future, to what extent do people have the determination to change their outcomes? Because a lot of ex-Muslims say that God knows that I was going to become this, so what control do I have?
So for that, I'm just going to change this board maybe and give you a small, because this is a very fundamental question. You see, what happens here is that this question of determinism and fatalism, which means that if we are predestined, if everything is predestined, then what's the point in punishing people for what they have been already programmed for? So, and of course, the other question is that if this is the case, then God is, God forbid, he's very oppressive, he's very unfair, because he's programmed certain individuals to do good, and others who are going to do bad. So God has already, in fact, it seems, decided whether a person is going to go to hell or not, or to heaven for that matter. So I think that the thing that you need to understand here is that as far as God is concerned, he has given you the full liberty to take action and responsibility of your deeds, except in certain areas where he has destined certain things. For example, I cannot change my parents, I cannot determine my parents, I cannot change my appearance to a certain extent, I cannot change my country. So there are certain things which God has destined. I cannot have control over these things. But God is not going to hold you accountable for these things. So remember, where you don't have control, you will not have accountability. It is only in areas where you have control and discretion to do what you like and what you do is an area in which you'll be held accountable. So if a person does not accept God, or if a person accepts God and is indifferent to the responsibilities that entail, that should be done, all these things are a matter of his choice. It's not that God has sort of driven him to do good or bad. So the Quran has actually pointed out this in a very clear verse. It says, "Man sha'a fal yu'min, man sha'a fal yakfur," which means any person who'd like to accept, it's up to him, and any person who would like to deny, it's up to him. So it's not correct to say that God has programmed us, has made our destiny. We choose our destiny. The only thing that you can say is that, can I write here? Is this okay, this pen? Okay, so, I mean, the thing that actually confounds us is that if God is, what I can say is that we are going to be responsible for what we did, but the thing is that what we will do is already in the knowledge of God. So what we say here is that it's not that God is driving us to do right and wrong. He has left the options to us. But the choices that we will ultimately make in a particular lifetime, for example, I have come to Australia, I'll go back and I'll spend such and such a time in another country, then go back, maybe write a book. So all these things are in the foreknowledge of God. It's just that He knows what I'm going to do, but He's not driving me. He's not programmed me to do. All that He is doing is that He knows that I, as a person, the choice that I will ultimately make is His in knowledge. So the two must not be mixed up. If you're able to make sense of the fact that God's knowledge is independent of our doings. He knows what we are going to do, but He's not driving us to do that. We are simply free to choose our path. Yes, so the thing that I wanted to probably illustrate this example was that, look at this, for example, if this is let's say a lifespan. Let's say a person called Adam. He was born at a certain point of time, and he's going to pass away at here. So he's going to die here. So if you look at God, He is standing right here. I'm just a hypothetical thing. And there's no day of judgment as well. The day of judgment is yet to come. This is the lifespan of a particular person who was born in, let's give it a hypothetical date. So he was, let's say, born in 1945, and he just passed away in 2024. So this span that he has spent, whatever he did, once he became mentally mature, obviously he was a child for some time, but then he started to take decisions. He said that, okay, I'm going to take these subjects for my school. Okay, then when I grow up, this is the profession I'm going to choose. Okay, when I finally start my career, I'll choose a spouse, and then we will go for vacations, and we'll have children, etc., etc. So all these choices actually are made by the person himself. But God is standing here near the end of his lifetime. So it's like he has a whole picture in front of him. He knows, well, if Adam is going to be 21, he's going to take engineering, he's going to marry someone who's going to be called Mary or whatever, and then he's going to have so many children and going to go for a vacation, etc. So remember, God is right here. So when he's here, it's like a picture that he's taking of a person who is passing through that life. So if you look at this independently and look at this independently, there should be no confusion. When God is standing right near the end of times, of course God cannot be imagined, but I'm saying because he was always there, so let's say this was the start of times. And this is like the end of time. So it's like God is always existing. He's there all the time. So even when Adam was not born, God was there. And even when Adam is going to die, God is still going to be there. So if you imagine God's lifespan to be eternal, he's always there. So every person who is going to be born, let's say, from the start of times till the end of times, because God is standing right here. He knows what Zainab is going to do. He knows what Fatima is going to do. And all these things are in his knowledge. But he's not forcing Zainab to be the compere today, or Fatima to be the compere today. He's not forcing you to come. Maybe your father or mother are. But, after some convincing, you might have come yourselves today. But the thing is, whatever you are going to do is to be done or is going to take place by your own sweet choice. It's just that the film that's going to happen actually is in God's knowledge. So if you take this illustration, I think this should not be a problem to make us realize that people who choose to be non-believers or have other beliefs, it's actually something that they do by their own choice. It's not that God is asking them to become a non-believer. So God is basically has given them the tools to find out what the truth is. He expects you to be a seeker of the truth. And your sweet choice to do whatever you like.
Thank you. There are also other questions related to Jesus. So why do Muslims especially believe that Jesus will come back?
Well, this is the majority belief of the Muslims. I, for one, don't believe that he's going to come back, and I have reasons to believe that the Quran has said very emphatically that he was given death by God in this world, not crucified. He was not in any way crucified the way our Christian brothers think. He was given this natural death. So the words of the Quran are, Inni mutawaffika, which means that I'll give you death, warafiuka ilayya, and I'll not allow your body to be in any way mutilated by them, so I'll just also preserve your body. وَجَعِلُ الَّذِينَ اتَّبَعُوكَ فَوْقَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا, and I'll make your followers prevail over those people who are not going to follow you. So the word tawaffa here has been misinterpreted by many scholars, and because of certain ahadith which seemingly say that Jesus is going to come back, that people, the majority people have this belief. Otherwise, if you ask me, this is primarily a belief which is in its origin a Christian belief. So Christians believe that Jesus had died on the cross and he's going to come back and salvage humanity. And it is this belief that has infiltrated in our Muslim ahadith also and in their understanding. And as a result of that belief, most Muslims do believe. So I, for one, do not do so. And if you extend this further, the Jews also are waiting for a Messiah. So when Jesus actually came, who is the Messiah as per the Quran, they did not accept him. And they said that how can a Messiah be crucified and how can the Messiah be in such dire straits? So they never accepted the Messiah who is actually Jesus. So they are waiting for their own Messiah. The Christians are waiting for the return of Jesus, and a very vast majority of Muslims. So what I'm saying is like a very, very minority view, but a very large part of the Muslims, they believe that Jesus is set to return. And as I said, the reason for this belief is that some ahadiths which speak of his return have been misinterpreted. Otherwise, the Quran has a very clear stance on this, that Jesus died in this world. He's not going to come back.
Yeah. Why are Jews going to be damned for the rest of the world if they weren't the ones who were arrogant and deniers? They're just descendants.
That's a beautiful question. So for that, I'll have, okay, forget about it. So basically, you see, the Jews are also set to undergo another law of the Almighty. So I was just talking about this law that I spoke of, that messengers of God, if they are intentionally denied in this world, then they are destroyed. This is one law of God. Another law of God relates to the progeny of Abraham. So for them, the law of God is that if they, in their collective capacity, adhere to the truth, they'll always remain dominant. So we know the Israelites at one time remained dominant. The Ishmaelites, of course, they also had this liberty, or they enjoyed this dominance. But if they do not do so, then they will be thrashed. And if they are thrashed for their misdoings, then this is something that's going to happen unless the later generations, they realize that they have done something wrong, and they can always come back. So it's not a law that is like eternal law. It's a law if you persist with the wrongdoings of your forefathers.
There's two questions here, so they're long. I'm going to read it out and then I can repeat it.
Okay.
Are we going to be held accountable for every single sin? What if we have repented? Would we still be inquired about it? Also, let's say we have wronged someone in this life and they have not forgiven us, but we have repented and made amends to God. Are we still held accountable?
So you see, there are two kinds of sins. Sins that we commit against God, and in which a person is not offended. So if we repent before God and God forgives us, then those sins are deleted from our account, and they would no longer be there when we wake up on the Day of Judgment. They'll not be figuring in our account. But then there are another type of offenses in which we actually offend a person. I mean, maybe we hurt a person, we do some fraud with that person. For such sins, God says that on the Day of Judgment, you and the perpetrator and the victim will be face to face with one another. You can ask for forgiveness from that person. And if he forgives you, fine. Otherwise, the sin will be permanently found in your account, and it will add to the ultimate, of course, weight of the sins that you would carry. So yes, the things that would be forgiven would be deleted. Others in which you have to ask for forgiveness from the person who had offended you. So if that person, or the offender, if that person forgives you, well and good. Otherwise, it will stay in your account and, of course, amount to whatever ultimate destination you are going to go to.
Yeah. If it still stays in the account, how about if you had the intention to ask them, but you didn't have the time or opportunity to?
So all these are very legitimate excuses. You can always tell this, that, well, I forgot, or maybe I didn't have the time, or later on, you moved to another country, I was not accessible, so I'm truly and really sorry for what I did. So all this will make your case stronger. I mean, it will give you more leverage to earn the forgiveness of the other person. After all, the other person also has a heart. He would not be a vindictive person. So in all probability, if these are the excuses, I mean, these would be taken into account.
Yeah, thank you. In an Islamophobic society, is it mandatory to wear a hijab if it's a struggle to believe and live in?
So in Islamic society, wearing a hijab for women, or wearing beards or keeping a beard in the case of a Muslim man is concerned, is entirely your personal choice. A state can never interfere. It cannot interfere in the personal choice of a believer. If it does so, it actually exceeds its authority. The Quran has made it absolutely clear that unless there is some violation, unless you're usurping the rights of some other person, there cannot be any legislation that can be done. As far as your personal life is concerned, if you would like to choose to wear the hijab, it's your choice. And ultimately, if it is right or wrong, that is going to be decided on the Day of Judgment. But in this world, any personal choice cannot be in any way interfered by the state, in the sense that the state says that, well, if you don't do this, for example, we know that this happens in Afghanistan and Iran, that if women don't wear hijab, or if men don't keep beards, then they are publicly and they are penalized, or they are even jailed for this offense. But in our understanding, this is absolutely breaching the contract that you have. You have a broader contract with the citizens of the state, and as far as these deeds are concerned, they are a matter of a person's own choice.
And in an Islamophobic society where it's hard to wear hijab, is it fine to not wear it?
So it all depends on the concept of hijab. You see, as far as the head covering is concerned, if you call that a hijab, then according to my understanding and understanding of from whom I have learnt religion and other scholars, wearing the head covering or covering your hair is only mandatory when you have embellished your hair, when you have made up your hair, maybe something added to your hair. If you just combed your hair, it's like, simple keeping of the hair, then covering the hair is not mandatory, although it might be recommended. So if this is the understanding, obviously then it would never be a problem, because it is only when you have made up your hair, you have adorned your hair, you have somehow added something to it, does it become mandatory to cover it. But let's say for a woman or a girl who thinks that it is mandatory at all instances, so in such situations where there is life at threat maybe, or your honor is at threat, or anything in which you are not able to live a life which you would like to live, and you do away with this thing, I would certainly think that God would relent on such a person and deal leniently with such a woman, I would say. So I would still think that if this is what happens in certain cases, for example, it might be very easy in a country which is Islamophobic, but it is much more difficult in which the law is such that, for example, in France, you cannot wear the hijab by law. So that amounts to persecution. But other than the France, where you by law are forced not to wear it, if, for example, in Australia or in any other country, you feel that your freedom or your own honor is in jeopardy or in danger, then if you discard your head covering, I don't think God would punish us for that.
Yeah. So we all have many questions regarding how to incorporate reading the Quran in our lives. So what advice would you give to someone who's having difficulty in finding the time to consistently read the Quran and make that a habit?
Yes, that's a very good question, and I think it's relevant to all of us. First thing, that the Quran is a very powerful book of God. It's a message that is so powerful that if you are able to understand it, it propels us to follow it. It's such a potent message. So one of the things that might be helpful to you is that you can for the moment, I mean, you can adopt a two-pronged strategy because all of you are young, all of you, mashallah, have a lot of vigor and energy, and you can utilize your time also. So adopt a two-pronged approach. One, read the Quran without the Arabic. Just forget about the Arabic, just read the translation. And for that too, what I would suggest is that don't plunge into the translation by starting off with Surah Fatiha from the beginning. It's not a book to be read cover to cover in your first reading. So start off with small selective, in fact we have a book here which is called Selections from the Quran, something to that effect, in which instead of going through the Quran, I mean by plunging yourself into a big book, it's like an overview of the Quran, a very short primer to the Quran in which you are introduced to the message of the Quran. So start off with that. So once you are able to complete that, the next thing I would suggest is that for example, you have gone through the selections. Now you have the whole book before you. So a very, very interesting method to read a book which is of such a voluminous nature is that every day for 5 or 7 minutes, open up the Quran from any place, just from any place. Don't do it sequentially. Just open up randomly from any place and again just read the translation. And for that part, you read the translation and the next day, again, don't start with where you ended the previous day. Again, open the Quran randomly. This is something which, I mean, is like a thrilling thing because you see, once you are going in a sequence, because the Quran is a continuous book, so what you read yesterday might have gone, I mean, you might have forgotten what you read yesterday and you might not connect that. But when you start afresh, so every time you start afresh, you will have that message, that particular message of that day with you for the rest of the day. So do that for 5 minutes every day. And there is an app that I can suggest because all of us have phones. It is called Quran Explorer. It's a very user-friendly app. It's available at iStore. It's available at Play Store. So if you download this, what happens is that you are able to listen to the Quran recitation if you would like to whenever, and also if you press the button, the recitation will stop and you will have a translation of the portion that you have read. So my suggestion to you would be that if you are able to download this app, this is one way in which instead of reading you can listen, and that is equally good. So reading is as good as listening. So this was one pronged approach in which you just rely on the translation and absorb the message, and when you do it every day, so do it for 5 minutes. Don't prolong it, because in order to make something a habit, it's always good to start with a small portion of that thing. This is a tip that holds good for everything, whether it's exercise, whether it's any routine that you start with a small manageable amount. So whenever you start something new, start with a manageable small amount. So that's precisely what I'm saying, that read the Quran with that translation in a very, very manageable way. And I think 5 minutes is something that maybe all of us can manage. So this is one strategy, that if you have just 5 minutes to give, you will be not burdened. Okay, the other strategy. The other strategy which I would suggest for young minds like you would be to learn the Arabic language in a way that when the Quran is being read, you are not dependent on the translation. You can understand the Quran directly, the way you can understand English or Urdu when it is being read or spoken. You don't need any translation. So for that you'll need a little more time and a little more concentration, and you don't need to rush it. You can spread it over 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years. And again, it's just a question of maybe 10-15 minutes every day in learning Arabic language, such that maybe after 5 or 6 or 7 years, you will be in a position that when you listen to the recitation or when you read the Quran yourself, it's going to have an impact directly on you. So remember, a translation can never replace the original. So the strategy that I suggested earlier on was a strategy that is based on your current proficiency of the English or the Urdu language. So that's something that's going to, at least start you with and connect you with the Quran. And the second approach is that in the longer term, let's say in the next 5 or 7 years, if you're able to give, again, 5 or 10 minutes of learning Arabic, and by the way, there are also very good sites that teach you Quranic Arabic. The one is called arabicacademy.com, and then there are others, because you can place yourself according to your proficiency, and they give you these lessons of Quranic Arabic. So if you are able to make this a target in your life, that from today I'm going to attach myself to the Quran in this translation and read it 5 minutes every day, and parallel to that I'll start another assignment, and that is I'll slowly and surely try to understand the Quran from its original by learning the language of the Quran. So if these two can be done parallel to one another, it will not take you long when you're able to make yourself conversant with the Quran. And even if the second is maybe something that's not figuring in your targets and your tasks and your assignments, even then, the first one, which is actually attaching to the Quran immediately because you know the translation, is still going to do its job. I mean, it's going to do its job, but in order to make it more optimum, the best thing is that you also adopt that other strategy. And you know why I say that? I say that because, you see, the impact of the words of God himself, the impact that they have, no translation would have it. Yes, the translation is going to acquaint you with the message. It's going to bring you to the message, closer to the message. But you know what the extra element is in the language that you understand directly, and especially if that is coming from God, it actually inspires you to act upon what is said. You find that urgency in you. You find that motivation and inspiration that you're not just reading the message, but you have the inspiration of following it as well, of adopting it in your life as well. So it's like an extra benefit that you draw. It's like an extra injection that you get. So these are the two approaches I would suggest.
Thank you. That was very informative. One of the questions I had was in relation to Quranic Arabic. Like, if we can study that, would that make it easier?
Just one thing that I'd like to make clear is that, you see, learning Arabic is different from learning Quranic Arabic. So there are a lot of websites that would teach you Arabic. I would not recommend going there unless you plan to go to an Arab country, settle there, because they're going to teach you how to speak Arabic. So that's what I'm advocating here. What I'm advocating here is to learn Quranic Arabic, even if you're not able to speak Arabic, because that's not a concern unless I'm settling in an Arabic country. My concern is that I can comprehend Arabic. Whenever Arabic is read, I am able to understand that. So for that, we have specific websites which just deal with Quranic Arabic, and the time that you'll need to understand Quranic Arabic is much shorter than learning the whole of Arabic, because the whole of Arabic has a lot of other things. It has speaking skills, it has writing skills, and then, of course, comprehension. I'm talking about comprehension, and that too only of the Quran.
And is there like the best way to start your Quranic Arabic journey?
Again, as I said, I mean, these are websites. If you type the word Quranic Arabic in your Google, or maybe Google Scholar, there are so many apps that come up. There are so many websites that come up. And I can also recommend a few. But my recommendation or my suggestion would be that, you see, every one of you has a different background. Every one of you has a sort of a different journey that you have come from. So these are various websites that can give you some placements regarding the background that you have. So there are some websites that start from the very beginning, as if you know nothing. And there are certain websites that start that you know Nazara Quran, for example. You can read the Quran, but you don't understand it. And there are certain other websites which, because of certain, ethnicity, we all know Urdu. So those of you who know Urdu, for them, Arabic becomes much easier because there's a number of common words between the two. So, and there are then still other people who might not even know Urdu. For them, there are still other websites who teach you Arabic without this background of Urdu. So I think it's like a little search that you can do, and you can adjust to that, keeping in view the background that you have.
Do we get the same reward when reciting the Quran as we would reading the English translation?
Well, I just explained that. The impact that, let me give you this example. If you're conversant, if you like poetry, or if you're a literary person, and for example, you're reading Shakespeare, or you're reading Milton, you're reading Byron, all these are very outstanding poets and playwrights of their times. If you can understand them directly, the impact that a guide or a translation of these words or an explanation of the words is going to do is going to be much more, because now you are able to absorb the very message from the author. So similarly, if you're able to understand the Quran directly, I just said, the extra element which is added is that you get that motivation, that inspiration that I'm being spoken to by God. And this is something that really works wonders, and you are propelled, you are inspired into doing what the Quran is asking you. So that is something which is added. I'm not saying that it's not there when you just read the English. I'm just saying that the impact is less. But you still get the message. You still get to get yourselves acquainted with God's message. But that inspiration that you can get when you are directly understanding the Quran from its original language is sort of reduced.
Yep. Same goes for listening to the Quran?
Yeah, same goes for listening, because if you're listening to the Quran and you don't know anything what the Quran is saying, it's like, I would say it's a waste of time. Why would you do that? Why should we listen or even read the Quran when we have absolutely nothing to gain from this listening and reading? So remember the Sahaba, the companions, or the Prophet himself, for them it made sense because it was their language. When they listened or they read, it was something that was, easily comprehensible. But for us, I see no point in the Quran being recited anywhere without we being able to get ourselves acquainted with its meaning. So whether it's listening or whether it's just reading, I would recommend in both cases that you start these two things parallel. When you don't know Arabic, until the time you don't know Arabic, just read it with a translation. And parallel to that, start your quest, start your journey to learn Arabic independently.
You covered how we can have, we start personally first by ourselves, but would you encourage us to read and understand the Quran with a teacher, a scholar, or in a group?
Okay, so my advice is that the Quran has said about itself that it is guidance for mankind. It is something that has been revealed for every single person. So there are levels of understanding the Quran. The minimum level is that level in which every one of you can just pick it up. You don't need to go to a teacher. Just read the translation. Simple English, simple Urdu, simple German, and you'll get an impact out of it. Then, maybe when you read the Quran, maybe you have a question. Maybe at some part of the translation, you don't fully understand what is implied here. So on such occasions, you can ask your teacher, maybe consult a tafsir, or, do all these things. But to start the Quran, you don't need to go to a teacher. A simple translation is the teacher itself.
Yeah. The Quran is known to be the greatest miracle in Islam. Could you provide a summary and elaborate on that?
Okay, this is a number of overtones and undercurrents, I would say. But I would just say one thing which the Quran has said about itself, which makes it an abiding miracle, something that cannot be copied, something that cannot be regarded to be done in the human plane. So there is just one distinction, it's not just one, it's a huge one, and it is like an umbrella. It has several other things underneath that umbrella. But one thing which distinguishes human authorship from God's authorship is what the Quran has said at one place. It says, لَوْ كَانَ مِنْ إِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجَدُوا فِي اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا, which means that had the Quran been authored by human beings, you would have found a lot of discrepancies in the Quran. So you can see from this that the miracle of the Quran lies in the fact that there are no discrepancies, there are no contradictions in the Quran. What it said from the very beginning, it adhered till the very end. Whereas, as human beings, when we author works, if we go through a process of evolution, we have ideas, we discard them, we go to a next idea, and maybe until we reach our middle ages or maybe our later middle ages, we reach our pinnacle. And even then, we are not perfect and we make mistakes and there could be contradictions. So the Quran says that it is a book which does not have any contradictions. And this is one thing which makes it different from human books, because human books, they have contradictions. The information might not be fully, verifiable. It could be wrong information. It could be the fact that you have ideas that continue to develop. You discard them and then adopt new ones. So this is not the case with the Quran. The Quran is without discrepancies, and the message that it gave at the beginning, it never went through any evolution of ideas. It did not develop. It was the same message that was there from the beginning until the end. So the miracle of the Quran lies in the fact that it cannot be simply copied by human beings, because whenever we would like to create something, look at the best of the books that have been written by human authors. They are still fraught with lack of information, wrong information, or the fact that that information was something that they actually did not subscribe to a little while ago, maybe in their previous editions. So you're continuously evolving in your ideas. Human beings are continuously developing in their ideas. This is not the case with God's discourse.
In terms of like when you interpret the Quran, there's slight variations on how different scholars perceive it, right? As someone who's new and who wants to start reading the translation, how can we know, which translation to read?
Yeah, this is also a very important question. I think the easiest way is that whenever you read a translation or a tafsir and some question comes to your mind, or maybe if you're doing some comparative study, for example, you're studying 2 or 3 tafsirs at the same time. So all that you need to do is study the reasoning that is offered by a Quran interpreter about a particular verse and just see which convinces you more. And for this, if someone says that I'm not a scholar, how can I judge whether it is right or wrong? My observation and my humble suggestion is that you don't need to be a scholar to judge between a person who has a different interpretation, maybe conflicting interpretation, just as when we go to a doctor and we take our child who is sick. So I'm not a doctor, but when I go to a pediatrician or a child doctor, one child doctor, I'll go to him and ask him, what is your diagnosis? Of course, he'll give me something, he'll tell me something, he'll present some reasoning, and maybe I'm satisfied, maybe I'm not satisfied. So someone asks me, okay, go and take a second opinion. I go to another doctor. And then if I feel that I need to take a third opinion. So without being a doctor myself, and by just looking at what they said to me regarding my child, don't I choose and say, well, he makes more sense, and he makes more sense. In the same way, in exactly the same way, I'm not a scholar, you may not be a scholar, or someone else might not be a scholar, but if you have conflicting opinions coming your way, you can easily say, well, this person is making more sense. So the person who makes more sense to you is the person that you should follow.
Yeah. Simple as that.
It's as simple as that.
दो अप्रोचेस होते हैं जो हमारे सब कॉन्टिनेंट में जो करा रहे हैं, एक लफ्जी तर्जुमे के साथ पढ़ाते हैं जिसमें वो कहते हैं कि वर्ड्स रिपीट होंगे, बिल्कुल, और एक होता है कि अरबिक ग्रामर विच बिल्कुल सरगर्दान है, ठीक है, तो व्हिच वन आपको? सो
आई थिंक बोथ ऑफ देम आर अप्रोचेस दैट can be adopted, either one of them, because the one which goes through this literal translation, this lafzi tarjuma aapne kaha, that has also worked wonders, and that has also created people who are able to understand the Quran, and that is perhaps the easier approach, in which you are not actually studying the language, but you are just sort of learning the translation by repetition of words and just having a picture of those words. The other one is slightly more time consuming, it needs more effort, and so if you are able to do that, that will produce more results, because in that case the meaning that you will get to is more precise, it will be more closer to the text. So it's not that the other one is not closer, it's slightly more closer. So both are fine, but if you have the time and the energy and the and the sort of intellect, then I would recommend that you adopt the other approach in which you learn the language.
दूसरा क्वेश्चन मेरा ये था, जब भी आपने पहले बात की, किसी इंसान को ज़िंदगी 20 साल मिलती है, किसी को 80 साल मिलती है,
Correct.
तो फिर मतलब मौका किसी को थोड़ा मिला है गुड डीड्स करने के लिए, किसी को ज़्यादा मिला है, तो उसको कैसे हम?
So you see, I mean, whatever the opportunity of life you got, whatever the span of life you got, you'll be judged according to that span. So don't think if a person is given more life, he has more chances of doing good deeds. I mean, the test is equally tough for him, because doing bad deeds is also the same opportunity or the same option that applies to him when he's given more life. So it's that at times you have a shorter lifespan, at times you have a longer lifespan. The longer lifespan is more challenging because you get more exposure, you're given more lurings that you can be attracted to in a lesser lifespan. And to top it all, you have to understand that God is just. I mean, justice is going to reign supreme on the day of judgment. So even if there is something that you might not be able to make sense of, that how can such a person be held accountable, always think that God is going to mete out that justice, and maybe people who have a smaller lifespan, for example, kids, maybe 12-year-olds, 11-year-olds who have just started to see the world, for them the accountability would have a different sort of a version, I would say. And for adults it would be slightly different, and for people who have more time spent, it will be different. So what we can say in our limited human understanding is that even if we are not able to comprehend some scenarios, we just should leave them to God, because God is going to be just. He's not going to tolerate any sort of injustice, and every person will be given his or her due.
Thank you. Any more questions? Floor's open. If not, I have one question.
Okay.
They say that when you're reading the Quran, you should have some time for personal reflection as well. Some people do journaling. They call it Quran journaling. Do you think that personal reflection should come after understanding the meaning of the tafsir, or is that something you can do without it? How do you balance
it
that?
It can happen anytime. So personal reflection or meditation or spending time on what you have read or understood. I mean, in my opinion, it comes naturally. I mean, you just cannot force it upon you. It's like a natural state that comes upon you, that when you read something inspiring, something that hits you, something that has an impact on you, you always reflect on that thing. So on most occasions, if you understand what you have read, that reflection is going to come automatically, because it's going to hit you, it's going to ask you, what are you doing and what is this message saying? So that is something that's going to come on its own accord. But at times, if this doesn't happen, then obviously this is what we tell our students when we teach them the Quran. We'll tell them, okay, you read this verse, the next day you come up, and then we'll have a discussion. So that discussion basically is meant to create that food for thought for that person to have that self-reflection. So if it is not automatic, then we create an atmosphere in our classrooms as Quran teachers so that people are instigated, they are inspired into self-reflection. So I think it's something that can be done through either of these two agencies.
Yeah. There are many people who memorize the Quran,
right?
Is that something you'd encourage, or memorizing some bits to build a deeper connection with?
Yes, you see, one of the things that makes you connect to God is the prayer, the namaz or the salat. And in the salat, you know that we read the Quran, and we read the Quran in a way that we have just a few surahs at our disposal. We have Qul huwallahu ahad, Qul a'udhu birabbil falaq, Qul a'udhu birabbin nas, or maybe a couple of other surahs. And this actually, if I am allowed to say this word, creates a little monotony, and it's like going through the same motions every day. So if you are able to learn some more surahs, it's going to have that impact of making your prayer more lively, more vibrant, because you have something new to read. So when you have something new to read, you will be more involved. So yes, I would encourage that. I would really recommend that besides reading the translation and learning Quranic Arabic, if this third streak can also be added, especially when you have holidays, that you learn some shorter surah of the Quran, of course by understanding their meaning, then you'll find your prayers to be lightened up. You'll find as if this is a new experience. And since you have raised this question, I'd like to spend a couple of minutes trying to explain to you that, how can we become regular in our prayers, and how is it that praying does not become a burden for us? Because you see, this is a fundamental requirement of religion, that we connect ourselves to God through the prayer. So I think that today, most Desi parents, and I'm a Desi parent myself, so I blame myself as well, we do not handle this issue of instructing our children how they should pray, or why they should pray, or what is the way that we should tell them. So our approach normally is that, okay, come on, have you said your prayers? No, go back and say your prayers and then come to me. It's like more of a controlling thing that we do. It's like imposing a thing. It's like without making them understand why they need to pray, we just start to order them around. I think this is a very wrong way of not only teaching how to pray, but in teaching religion in general. So the best way to teach your child, or as an adult grown-up child, your own self, is to always start off with the first question, that why should I do a certain thing? Why do I need to pray? Why do I need to fast? Why is it that I need to eat halal food? So the why should come first. And then, of course, the next part would be that you will search for the answer. So as far as the prayer is concerned, if I give you an example, when you are in this world, for example, Ariba and Zainab, you are two sisters. So if Ariba gives a gift to Zainab, Zainab will automatically feel indebted to her, isn't it? And when her birthday comes, Zainab would perhaps try to repay Ariba with a better gift. So you see, instinctively thanking individuals for a gift that you receive is very natural. I immediately feel indebted, and I make a mental note, well, the next time I'm given this opportunity, I'm going to pay back, I'm going to gift that thing back. If you extend this, you can, if you go on extending the gifts that you have, you can go to the very first cause and you can now understand that whatever we have is basically God's gift. We didn't earn it. And I start off with our eyes. I mean, look at our eyes. We take them for granted. When you get up in the morning, we open our eyes. We never feel it's a blessing. Whereas look at people who are blind. Look at people who are going blind or maybe who are losing their eyesight. And you'll realize what a huge blessing this eye is. And how you can simply, I mean, you'll be lost if you're a person who knows, who is conversant with eyesight and suddenly he starts to lose his eyesight. So this is just one thing. So if you start counting God's favors, like you're able to have food, you're able to have 2 meals, you have clothes to wear, you have a shelter, you have access to education, you have access to health facilities. So if you just start moving back and back and back, that what is the source of these favors that you enjoy, ultimately you'll reach God, because it is God who created this earth, who created our parents, who gave us these opportunities, who gave us this normal body. So basically, it's just a question of relating our favors back to God that will make us a person who's grateful to God. So it is this gratitude which is reflected in the prayer. So just as Ariba and Zainab would be, I mean, they would be indebted to one another, I would be indebted to God when I realize that everything that I have is from God. And I would also realize that as a human being, maybe I can repay my friend. Maybe Ariba can repay Zainab for what she did. But I cannot repay God, because the amount of blessings that he has, and he's continuously giving them to me every day. The sun is shining every day. My parents are looking after me every single day. So I just cannot repay them. So God has said that you just do 2 things if you would like to acknowledge or show your gratitude to me. First, put your forehead on the ground and acknowledge my favors. So you know what? If you know that while the reason that you pray to God is to say thank you to him for whatever you have, you'll be impelled to do it, just as if the 2 of you would be, because you are now seeing what is being given to you. So we cannot see God, we cannot hear God, but we can feel God. We can have this feeling that these favors have been given to us by him. And when I'm praying, basically, what I'm doing is I'm just acknowledging him. I'm just thanking him. And the other thing is that I share my blessings with other people. So these are the 2 things that I do. But when I'm praying, basically, I am just saying that God, while kneeling, while prostrating, while doing sajda, and by sitting in At-Tahiyyat, if you look at the words that start off with the prayer, it's Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin. The very first sentence of Surah Fatiha is it says that gratitude be to God, who is the Lord of the worlds. So you start off with this feeling of gratitude. You are drenched with this feeling of gratitude that you have so much to thank God for. So if you relate the prayer that, well, I'm going to pray, it's not because my mom or dad is asking me to pray. It's because I think that God has given me so much that I need to acknowledge that. This is the first thing. You should know the why. The second is, don't start off by praying 5 times a day. It's going to be difficult. Start off by praying 1 a day, 1 prayer a day. Choose any one prayer, maybe Asr, maybe Zuhr, maybe anyone, Fajr. Just become regular in that prayer. Try to become regular in that prayer. Maybe do it for 3 or 4 months or 5 months. Then maybe you can add a second prayer. And maybe in 2 or 3 years or 4 years, you can have those 5 prayers. Yes, if you are able to do more at one time, it is fine. But in order to develop a habit, it is best to start with a very small amount, which is, of course, 1 prayer. And in that 1 prayer also, you just pray the Farz Rakat. The 2 of Fajr, the 4 of Zuhr, the 4 of Asr, the 3 of Maghrib, and the 4 of Isha. So just do that. And the third thing and final thing that I'd like to say is that there are places in the Quran, there are places in the Salah that can be said in your own language, which is English or Urdu or Farsi or anything. There are just 5 instances in the prayer that have to be said in the Arabic language. And all other instances or postures within the prayer, I'll just describe them to do very briefly. You can talk to God in your own language. So the 5 instances that you might note or make a mental note of, one is Allahu Akbar. So whenever you say Allahu Akbar in the prayer, like when you start the prayer, when you go for kneeling and you stand up. So these are the change of posture positions in which you say Allahu Akbar. So that has to be in Arabic. And it means God is the greatest. Then Surah Fatiha that you read in every rakat, that has to be in Arabic. Then the third is whenever you read a surah of the Quran after Surah Fatiha, like Qul Huwallahu Ahad or Qul A'udhu Bil Falaq, that has to be in Arabic. The third is Sami Allahu liman hamida, which means that God heard the prayer of that person who showed gratitude to him. So Sami Allahu liman hamida whenever you stand up from that kneeling position has to be said in Arabic. And the last is Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah when you end the prayer and you look at both sides. Apart from these 5 instances, all other instances, at all other postures, you can talk to God, you can pray to Him, you can make a wish, you can ask for forgiveness. And within the prayer, for example, when you are kneeling, and normally you say Subhana Rabbi al-Azim. So this is just one recommended thing. Besides that or without that, you can say any dua that comes to you, anything that comes to you at that kneeling position. Similarly, when you're doing sajda, which is prostration, normally we say Subhana Rabbi al-Ala. So that is one recommendation. Other than that, again, you are free to choose anything that you'd like to say to God. And then you know what? The biggest area that you are also totally at liberty to say whatever you would like is the At-Tahiyyat portion, which comes in the middle of the prayer, of the 4 rakat prayer, and also near the end. So although we can say the same words that we have been taught, like At-Tahiyyatu lillahi wa salawatu wa tayyibatu, that's one option. But other options are that you can again utter any prayer that comes to your mind in your own language. You don't have to be specific in Arabic. If you'd like to say it, it's fine. But it's not mandatory. The mandatory parts in Arabic are just those 5. Allahu Akbar, Surah Fatiha, a surah that is added after Surah Fatiha, Samir Allahu liman hamida, and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Other than these 5 areas, the whole of the prayer, you sit between the prostrations, you can even say anything that comes to your mind. Similarly, when you start the prayer, normally we say Subhanak Allahumma before we say Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. So even in Subhanak Allahumma, you can say any other prayer in your own language. So if you're able to know this, that this prayer is going to immediately connect you to God, because now it's not just the Arabic, which you might not be very well versed with. It's your own language also that you can add within the prayer. So you don't need to pray to God after you say Assalamu alaikum and then you raise your hand and say something. Okay, that you can also do. But within the prayer, when you're still in the prayer, you can say these words in your own language. And this is singularly one thing that immediately focuses you more towards God. Because when you're reading a foreign language, your thoughts are going to go astray, commonly. But when you sing something in your own language, still you can go astray, still you can deviate, but the chances are less. So now you can see that the prayer is an amalgam. It's a mixture of Arabic and your own language, which will actually make it more interesting. So the tip, as I said, is the first is why should you pray? To thank God. The second is just start off with 1 prayer a day. And the third is that within the prayer also you should know that you can speak your own language. So if you add these features to your prayer, I can assure you, because this is a feedback that we keep getting on from younger people, that praying becomes such an interesting thing that you know what? You look forward to it. You wait for it. You say, okay, the time has arrived, I should talk to God. I think this is how we can really make the prayer very, very interesting.
That's very interesting. I had a question. What's the best place in the prayer to make a dua?
The At-Tahiyyat portion. When you're sitting in the last 4th rakat, when you say At-Tahiyyatu lillah, and even in the middle At-Tahiyyat, after 2 rakats, you also sit down, and you get up after saying Ashhadu la ilaha. So in the 2nd rakat, when you sit down, you can say the prayer, say the dua, and you can say the dua in At-Tahiyyat also. And other than that, when you're in your sajda, even then you can make dua. When you are in the kneeling position, when you say Subhana Rabbi al-Azim, even then you can make dua. So dua is one thing that can be made at either of these places, but in At-Tahiyyat, because you get more time, so you can extend that as well.